She didn't scream. That was the thing nobody talked about later. Evelyn Blackstone, worth $4 billion, featured on 3 magazine covers that month alone, stood in a filthy alley off West 47th Street, with a blade pressed against her ribs, and she didn't make a single sound. Not because she was brave, because she was calculating. Always calculating. Then a hand came out of nowhere, massive, certain, unafraid, and everything changed in under 4 seconds. The man who saved her life didn't ask for her name, didn't ask for anything. And that silence. That was the thing that would destroy her. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. And if this story hits different, hit subscribe. You're going to want to be here for what happens next. The knife appeared first. That's how Evelyn would remember it later. Not the men, not the alley, not even the fear. Just the knife. A cheap folding blade, the kind you'd find at any pawn shop south of 34th Street, catching the orange glow of a street lamp as it came up fast and pressed flat and cold directly against the left side of her ribcage. "Phone," said the one holding it. He wasn't shouting. That was the worst part. He was completely calm, the way people get calm when they've done something enough times that it stops feeling dangerous to them. Wallet, watch, right now. Evelyn's security detail, 2 men, both former law enforcement, both paid extremely well, was half a block away at the curb beside her car, arguing about a coffee order. She had told them to wait there. She always told them to wait there when she needed 30 seconds of quiet air, 30 seconds of being a human being instead of a brand. That decision had taken her exactly 11 steps into the mouth of an alley she had walked past 100 times without ever looking at it. There were 3 of them. She clocked that immediately. One with the knife to her ribs, one cutting off the alley entrance behind her, and a third younger, shifting his weight from foot to foot, hanging back near the dumpster. A lookout, or a coward. Probably both. I said the watch. The knife pressed harder, not breaking skin. Not yet. Evelyn's mind was doing what it always did, calculating. She thought, if I scream now, Marcus and Chen are 50 feet away. But by the time they clear the entrance, this man's hand has already moved. She thought, the watch is a Patek Philippe $140,000 given to her by her father the week before he died. She thought, if I give it to him, I can replace everything else. She was reaching for the clasp with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate, when she heard it. Not a shout, not a warning, just a sound, a single hard footstep, and then the man with the knife was no longer standing in front of her. He was on the ground. It happened so fast that Evelyn's brain couldn't sequence it properly. One moment, cold steel against her ribs. The next, a large hand had closed around the man's knife wrist, twisted it outward with a sharp mechanical precision, and used his own forward momentum to fold him down toward the concrete. No wasted movement. No drama. The knife skittered under the dumpster. The man hit the asphalt with a grunt that knocked the air out of him. The second one, the one blocking the entrance, surged forward. The stranger turned to meet him and said very quietly, "Don't." Just that one word. The attacker stopped. Something in that voice reached past adrenaline and grabbed him by the spine. He stopped, looked at the man on the ground, looked at the stranger, and then looked at the third kid by the dumpster. A whole conversation happened in about 2 seconds. Then all 3 of them were gone. The one on the ground scrambled up and ran, and the other 2 were already half a block away before Evelyn fully exhaled. The stranger watched them go. He stood very still, hands loose at his sides, tracking the direction they'd run with a calm, practiced patience, like someone waiting to make sure a storm had actually passed before he put down his umbrella. Then he turned to Evelyn. He was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Some part of her, still processing at emergency speed, had conjured a vague image of someone large and aggressive, someone who looked like violence. Instead, she found a man who looked like he'd just come from a hardware store. Work boots, dark jeans with a smear of what might have been paint near the knee, a plain gray jacket, the kind that costs $40 and lasts 10 years. He was tall. She'd registered that, and there was a physical quality to him that wasn't quite bulk, more like density, like someone who had been built by actual labor rather than a gym. Early 40s maybe. dark hair starting to go at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. His eyes were the thing, steady dark measuring, not unkind, but not particularly soft either. "You hurt?" he asked. That was it. Not "are you okay," which would have been reflex, and not "oh my God," which would have been performance. Just the direct functional question. "You hurt?" "No," she said. Her voice came out cleaner than she felt. "I'm not hurt." He nodded once and looked past her toward the alley entrance, checking the sight lines, she realized. Old habit. He wasn't done making sure it was clear. "Your security's coming," he said. "I can see one of them." She turned. Marcus was jogging toward the alley entrance, hand already moving toward his jacket. When she turned back, the stranger was already moving away, headed deeper into the block in the opposite direction, hands back in his jacket pockets, like he was resuming an errand he'd briefly set down. "Wait," Evelyn said. He stopped but didn't fully turn, just half looking back over his shoulder. "I don't even know your name," she said. He looked at her for a moment, something in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. "Reynolds," he said. "Jackson Reynolds." Then Marcus was at her elbow, breathless and apologizing, and by the time she looked back toward the block, Jackson Reynolds was already gone. Dead. For 3 days she told herself she was simply curious. That was reasonable. That was rational. A man had appeared out of nowhere, and done something extraordinary, and then walked away like it was nothing, and naturally, she wanted to understand who that person was. Naturally, she had questions. Evelyn Blackstone was a woman who did not like unanswered questions. She'd built an empire on eliminating them. She did not tell herself that she lay awake on the first night reconstructing the sound of his voice. She did not acknowledge that on the second night, she found herself thinking about the way his hand had moved, not the violence of it, but the certainty. The total absence of hesitation. She had spent 15 years in boardrooms with powerful men, and she knew what certainty looked like when it was performed and when it was real. His had been real. On the third day, she called her head of security, a former FBI counterintelligence officer named Patricia Haverford, and gave her the name. By the end of the day, she had a file. Jackson Daniel Reynolds, 41 years old, born in Knoxville, Tennessee. Enlisted in the U.S. Navy at 18. 20-year career. 2 tours in the Middle East. Qualified as a Navy SEAL at 24, served with SEAL Team 3 out of Coronado for 6 years before transferring to a training and evaluation role. Decorated. Quiet record. The kind of file that had several sections with dense, blacked-out paragraphs that even Patricia couldn't get into. Honorably discharged 4 years ago. Currently residing in Queens, New York. Currently employed as, Evelyn had read this part, twice a maintenance supervisor for a mid-size residential property management company. Responsible for a portfolio of 12 buildings in the borough. Hourly wage position. And one more thing, buried at the bottom of Patricia's summary like a footnote. Single father. Daughter, Emma Reynolds, age 7. Mother deceased. Evelyn set the file down on her desk and looked out her office window at the city for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her assistant. "Find me a reason to be in Queens on Thursday." She didn't ambush him. She told herself that clearly and believed it mostly. She found out which building he'd be doing inspections at that Thursday, a 12-story rental complex in Astoria, and she arranged to be walking past it at 11 in the morning, which was according to his work schedule, when he'd be dealing with a recurring issue in the lobby mechanicals. She was 30 feet from the entrance when the door opened, and he walked out, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a clipboard tucked under his other arm, and he looked up and saw her and stopped dead on the sidewalk. The recognition took about half a second. "Ms. Blackstone," he said. His voice was the same. She'd been half afraid she'd built it up into something it wasn't. She hadn't. "Mr. Reynolds." She let a beat land. "I wanted to thank you properly. The other night—" "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to." She met his eyes. "I wanted to." He watched her with that same measuring quality she remembered, like he was running a quiet calculation of his own. "You looked me up," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "I did," she said. "And now you're here." "And now I'm here." He shifted the toolbox to his other hand. A slight adjustment, easy and unconscious. "What is it you actually want, Ms. Blackstone?" The directness of it stopped her for exactly 1 second. Most people she dealt with spent the first 15 minutes of any conversation building toward the actual question. He was already there. "I want to offer you a job," she said. He looked at her. "My head of security is retiring at the end of the quarter," she said. "It's a senior position, director level. I've been looking at candidates for 2 months and none of them have what I saw in that alley. I'd like you to come in and talk." "No, thank you," he said. She blinked. "I haven't told you the salary." "Doesn't matter." "Mr. Reynolds, the number would—" "I'm sure it would," he said without any sharpness in it. "I appreciate the offer. I'm happy where I am." He said it the way someone says something that is simply true. No performance in it, no false modesty, no invitation to negotiate. He was happy where he was. That was the whole answer. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. In 15 years, she could count on one hand the number of times someone had said no to her without at least thinking about it first. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "You were a SEAL for 6 years. You could work anywhere in the private sector, security consulting, government contracts, training operations. High 6 figures, probably 7 if you positioned it right. Instead, you're doing HVAC inspections in Astoria." She paused. "Why?" Something moved through his expression. Not offense, not discomfort. More like the look of someone deciding how much of a real answer to give. "My daughter gets off the school bus at 3:15, he said. "I'm always there. This job lets me be there. Those other jobs don't." He picked up the clipboard. "That's the whole math." He gave her a slight nod, polite final, and started back toward the building. "I'll be in touch," she said to his back. He didn't turn around, but she heard very quietly what might have been a sound of dry amusement. She reached out 4 more times over the next 6 weeks. Not desperately, she was very clear with herself about that. Professionally. She sent a formal offer letter through a recruiter with the salary figure included, which was substantial enough that Patricia had looked at it twice when Evelyn dictated it. Jackson sent back a single line handwritten on the bottom of the letter, returned through the recruiter. "Appreciate it. Not interested." The handwriting was clean and angular and pressed firmly into the paper. She had lunch scheduled with a venture capital group in Midtown and found herself 20 minutes early because she'd taken a route through Queens for no reason she could explain to her driver, who did not ask. She sent a follow-up email, cordial brief, leaving the door open. He responded in 4 sentences that were so politely definitive they should have ended it. She thought about those 4 sentences for 3 days. What was happening to her was not something Evelyn was practiced at analyzing because it wasn't something she'd had much experience with. She had been in relationships, efficient ones, mostly with men whose worlds fit neatly alongside hers, men who understood that her schedule was the fixed variable, and everything else arranged itself around it. She had never once in her adult life thought about a person this persistently without understanding why. She wasn't delusional. She knew some of what she felt was fascination, the kind you get when you meet someone who operates on a completely different set of values than anything in your world. She knew some of it was pride, the bruise of being turned down. She was honest enough to admit that. But there was something else, something she didn't have clean language for yet. When she thought about Jackson Reynolds, she kept coming back to one thing: the hand that didn't shake. In that alley, in the half-second between the threat and the action, there had been no tremor, no delay, no calculation. Just decision. She had made hard decisions her entire career, billion-dollar pivots, layoffs that kept companies alive, calls that kept her up at night for years, and every single one of them had cost her something. There was always a tax. A cold sweat at 3 a.m. A voice in the back of her head asking what she might have missed. That hand had moved without paying any tax at all. She wanted to know how a person got there. She wanted to understand the architecture of that kind of certainty. And she was honest with herself always, because dishonesty was a luxury she couldn't afford. She wanted to be near it. So on a Tuesday in November, she called his work number, directly bypassing the recruiter, and asked if he would have dinner with her. Not a pitch. Not a second interview. Just dinner as two people who had met in an unusual way. There was a long pause on the line. Then, one dinner. She said one dinner. I picked the place, he said. She almost said something about that. She swallowed it. All right. The place he picked was a diner in Sunnyside. Red vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that came in a ceramic mug before you even asked. The kind of place Evelyn hadn't been inside since law school, when money had still been a concept she was working toward, rather than something that had long since stopped being one. She got there first and slid into a booth, and looked at the menu and felt against all logic slightly nervous. When he walked in, he scanned the room once left to right, entrance to exit before he found her. Habit. He crossed to the booth and sat down across from her and picked up a menu. You're not going to make this weird, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to try very hard not to, she said. Something shifted in his face, the closest thing she'd seen from him to a real smile. The waitress came, and he ordered the meatloaf and a coffee, and Evelyn ordered the same thing without thinking about it, which she only registered after the waitress left. He noticed. The edge of his mouth moved. Don't say it, Evelyn said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were absolutely going to say something. I was going to say, he said, that the meatloaf here is actually really good. She looked at him. That's what you were going to say. That's what I was going to say. She laughed. It came out before she could make it polished, and it was a real one, shorter and less composed than her public laugh, the kind that surprised her when it showed up. She saw him register it. They talked, and he was not what boardroom Evelyn would have predicted. He was not guarded in the way someone uncomfortable with conversation is guarded. He was guarded the way someone comfortable with silence is guarded, which meant the things he did say landed with weight. He talked about the Navy the way veterans sometimes do in flashes and edges, rather than full stories. But when she asked about his daughter, his whole bearing shifted in a way that was almost physical, like something in him came off duty. Emma, he said, had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, specifically to study octopuses, because she'd watched a documentary about their intelligence and had not recovered. She talked about it for 2 weeks straight, he said. Drew pictures, made a poster, gave me a presentation at the kitchen table with note cards she'd made herself. Note cards, Evelyn said. Color-coded note cards, he said. 7 years old. Something happened in Evelyn's chest that she did not immediately have a name for. The meatloaf was in fact very good. Toward the end of the evening, when the coffee had been refilled twice and the diner had mostly cleared out, Evelyn looked across the red vinyl booth at Jackson Reynolds and said the thing she'd been building toward all night. Jackson? First name. She watched to see if he'd adjust. He didn't. Why won't you date me? He looked at her for a long moment. Not uncomfortable, not surprised. She had the sense he'd been waiting for it, that the whole evening had been a long approach to this exact question, and he'd clocked it from the moment she sat down. Then he said it, and it crushed her completely. He didn't look away from her when he said it. That was the part she kept coming back to later. Most people, when they deliver something difficult, find somewhere else to put their eyes. A coffee cup, a window, the middle distance, some comfortable place that isn't the other person's face. Jackson Reynolds looked directly at her, and his voice was the same voice he'd used to say, "Don't to a man twice his size in a dark alley, quiet, certain, and completely without apology." Because the only person I could ever be with, he said, is someone who doesn't need me to be anything other than a father. My daughter comes first, always, and I won't risk that for anything or anyone. The diner sounds kept going around them. Someone's silverware scraped a plate. The coffee machine hissed. A couple near the window laughed at something. All of it felt very far away. Evelyn had prepared herself without fully admitting she was preparing herself for a version of rejection. She'd cataloged the likely ones on the drive over. You're my employer, effectively. Our worlds are too different. I'm not looking for a relationship right now. She'd even allowed for a more personal one, something about her reputation, her lifestyle, the sheer logistical weight of who she was. She could have handled any of those. She knew how to absorb a no and file it away and move forward. She was not prepared for an answer that had nothing to do with her. That was the thing that landed so hard. He hadn't said, "You're not right for me." He hadn't even said, "I'm not interested," which would have stung but made sense. He'd said something that was completely, almost impersonally, about his own architecture, like a man describing the load-bearing walls of a house he'd spent years reinforcing. "This is what I'm built around. This is what holds everything up. I don't move this not for anything, not for anyone." The word anyone had arrived last almost gently, but she'd felt it like a door being closed very quietly, but with total finality. She realized, sitting there in a red vinyl booth, with a half-eaten plate of meatloaf in front of her, that no one had ever made her feel so simultaneously seen and irrelevant. He wasn't cruel about it. There wasn't a single sharp edge in what he'd said, but the effect was the same as if he'd calmly set her down on a shelf and said, "You're not the priority here, and you never will be." Not because she wasn't worth it, but because something else simply mattered more. She picked up her coffee mug because she needed something to do with her hands. "How old was she?" Evelyn said. "When you lost her mother?" Jackson watched her for a moment, measuring. Then, 3. "And you've been doing this alone since then?" "I have help," he said. "Her grandmother comes twice a week. There's a neighbor, Mrs. Caruso, who Emma would honestly rather live with given the chance. She makes better food than I do." He paused. "But yeah, mostly." "Does Emma know," Evelyn said carefully, that you've closed off that part of your life?" "For her?" "She's 7, he said. "She doesn't need to know that." "She will someday." "Someday she will." He turned the coffee mug a quarter rotation on the table just to turn it. "I'll handle that then." Evelyn looked at him. "Don't you ever—" She stopped, started again. "Don't you ever want something for yourself?" He met her eyes steadily. "She is something for myself. She's the best thing I ever did. There's no sacrifice in it." He said the last part without drama, without weight. Just fact. "People keep waiting for me to act like it costs me something. It doesn't." Evelyn set down the mug. She didn't speak for a moment because she was doing something she almost never did. She was sitting with an emotion she hadn't processed yet, instead of immediately converting it into action. What she felt was not quite sadness, and not quite admiration, and not quite the specific ache of wanting something you genuinely cannot have. It was some unnamed alloy of all 3, and it was heavier than she expected. "I owe you an apology," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "I've been very persistent," she said. "The letters, the calls, tonight. I told myself it was professional interest, and She stopped. She was not a woman who stumbled over words. It annoyed her. "I wasn't being fully honest with myself about what I was doing." Jackson looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "I know." She looked up. "I know what you were doing," he said, not unkindly. "You're not the first person who's had trouble taking a no that came without a good enough reason. And I get it from where you're sitting. I probably look like I'm throwing something away. Good opportunity. Good life. Good—" He stopped, rerouted slightly. "You're used to people who want things. Everybody in your world wants something, and they'll bend whatever direction they need to get it. Somebody who just doesn't want to be moved, that reads as a puzzle." "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "I'm not a puzzle, Ms. Blackstone." He said it without any hardness. "I'm just a man who's already figured out what matters." The check came. He picked it up before she could reach for it, and when she started to object, he gave her a look that was so plainly simply decisive that she let it go without a word. He left cash, exact amount, plus a 20% tip she noticed without meaning to, and stood up and put on his jacket. At the door, he held it for her, and they stood outside on the sidewalk in the cold November air. Her car was 2 blocks down. His, she guessed, was somewhere else entirely. "Thank you for dinner," she said. Genuinely. "Sure," he said. "Jackson." She said it before she knew she was going to. "For what it's worth, Emma's lucky. Not every father would—" She stopped. "Not every father does what you do." Something passed through his face. It was brief and private, and she had the sense she wasn't supposed to have seen it. Then it was gone. "Good night, Ms. Blackstone," he said. She watched him walk away, hands in his jacket pockets the same way he'd walked away in the alley, like a man who had somewhere to be and was already thinking about it. She stood on that sidewalk in Sunnyside, New York, worth $4 billion, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt small, not diminished, not humiliated, just small, human-sized, like the world had suddenly recalibrated around a different set of measurements than the ones she was used to. She wasn't sure yet whether that feeling was terrible or necessary. She suspected it might be both. She did not contact him for 3 weeks. This was for Evelyn an act of discipline that took more effort than most people would imagine. It wasn't that she was obsessed. She had a company to run a board to manage 3 active acquisitions in various stages of negotiation. She was not pining. She was not sitting in her office staring at his file. What she was doing was something quieter and harder. She was thinking about what he'd said, turning it over the way you turn over a stone, to see what's living underneath. She thought about it during a conference call with her CFO. She thought about it in the back of the car on the way to a Thursday morning investor briefing. She thought about it at 2 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come, which was not unusual. She'd had a complicated relationship with sleep since her 30s, but the content of the 2 a.m. thinking was different now. Usually at that hour, she was processing market position or rehearsing difficult conversations. Now she was sitting in her kitchen with a glass of water, thinking about a 7-year-old girl who made color-coded note cards about octopuses and had no idea that her father had quietly walled off an entire part of being a person and given the space to her instead. She thought about her own father. A different man than Jackson Reynolds in almost every way, driven, acquisitive, brilliant, occasionally ruthless, the kind of man who could charm a room of 500 and forget his daughter's dance recital in the same week. He had loved her, she knew that. But his love had always been something she had to find the edges of something she'd spent years measuring, by what he showed up for and what he didn't. She had learned early not to be a priority. She had learned to be a footnote in someone else's main story, and to make her own story big enough that it didn't matter. She realized, spent the next 30 years looking for the version of her father that stayed, the version that showed up, the version that looked at her the way Jackson Reynolds looked at Emma, like she was the fixed point. Everything else moved around. She was sitting with that realization when her phone rang. It was her best friend Dana, who was a federal judge in Chicago, and therefore one of the very few people in Evelyn's life with enough personal authority not to be impressed by her. "Talk," Dana said instead of hello. She always said that. It was more efficient. Evelyn told her. Not everything, but enough. The alley, the file, the dinner. The answer. Dana was quiet for a moment when Evelyn finished. Then, "You caught feelings for a man who said no." "It's not, Evelyn. It's more complicated than—" "It never is," Dana said, and there was no cruelty in it, just the flat, fond pragmatism of someone who had known her for 28 years. "You're not complicated about this. You met a man who doesn't want to be managed, and he handled you with one sentence, and now you can't stop thinking about him because the last time someone didn't want something from you, you were in your 20s and didn't have anything to take." Evelyn was quiet. "Am I wrong?" Dana said. "You're not entirely wrong," Evelyn said. "So the question is," Dana said, "what are you going to do about it? And I want to be very clear before you answer, I'm not going to help you strategize how to get this man. He told you no. He told you why. That's a complete answer." "I know that." "Good. So what are you going to do?" Evelyn looked at the kitchen window, her own reflection barely in the dark glass. "I'm going to try to understand what he said," she said finally. "What it actually means." Dana made a sound, not quite a sigh, not quite approval, somewhere in between. "That's the first smart thing you've said in this conversation." "Thank you, Dana. I'm not done. You're one of the most capable people I've ever known, Evelyn, and you have absolutely no idea what it looks like when somebody loves something more than they love what they could gain from it." That man showed you that. The question isn't how you get closer to him. The question is what you do with the fact that you've apparently been surrounded by people who don't operate that way for your entire adult life. After she hung up, Evelyn sat with that for a long time. The fourth week, she sent him a message, not a job offer, not a pitch. A single text to the number she still had from when she'd called his work line. I heard what you said. I'm not reaching out for the reasons I was before. I'd like to know if we can be in each other's lives at all, in whatever way that looks like for you. You don't owe me an answer. She put the phone down and went back to work. He responded 6 hours later. She was in a board meeting when it came in and didn't look at it until after, which was its own small act of discipline. I appreciate that. I'll think about it. She read it 3 times. Then she put the phone in her desk drawer and left it there for the rest of the day. What she didn't know then, what she had no way of knowing sitting in her office with its 42nd floor view of a city she'd spent her life conquering, was that on the other side of that text message, in an apartment in Queens, Jackson Reynolds was sitting at a kitchen table across from a 7-year-old girl who had just launched unprompted into a detailed explanation of how octopus arms can act independently of their central brain. Each arm has its own neurons. Emma was saying with the focused intensity of someone delivering testimony. It's like they each have a little brain, so the octopus doesn't even have to tell them what to do. They just know. Is that right? Jackson said. That's right. She pointed her fork at him for emphasis, then seemed to remember her manners and put it back down. Dad, are you listening? I'm listening, he said. And he was. He always was. He thought about the text in his pocket for a moment, thought about the woman who'd sent it, who had surprised him at dinner in a way he hadn't fully anticipated, not with anything dramatic, but with a moment of honesty he hadn't seen coming. I wasn't being fully honest with myself. He'd heard a lot of things in his life from a lot of people, and he'd developed a decent radar for what was real and what was constructed. That had been real. He wasn't a man who made decisions quickly about things that mattered. He was the opposite. He was a man who made decisions slowly and then executed them without hesitation, because the time for doubt was before the commitment, not after it. He had learned that the hard way in places he never talked about, and it had served him well in ways he didn't advertise. So he sat with the text. He sat with the question it implied. What does this woman actually want, now that the original thing has been declined? And can I trust that she knows the difference? He sat with the memory of her face in the diner when she'd said I wasn't being fully honest with myself. The slight fracture in the composure, the way she'd looked briefly, like someone who was very capable and very alone, and was only just noticing both of those things at the same time. He knew something about being alone by choice. He respected it when he saw it. He also knew that chosen loneliness and imposed loneliness were different animals, and that sometimes people confuse them. Dad, Emma said. Yeah, Bug. Do you think we could go to the aquarium? They have an octopus, Mrs. Caruso said. He looked at his daughter, the dark eyes she'd gotten from her mother, the jaw she'd gotten from him, the complete and total focus she seemed to have inherited from some combination of both, and made entirely her own. Saturday, he said. She beamed. The kind of smile that made everything else a very manageable problem. He thought, I'll think about it. That was what he'd told her. He'd think about it. And so he did. It was a Tuesday morning 2 weeks later when Evelyn's assistant knocked on her office door and said, There's a Jackson Reynolds downstairs. He says he doesn't have an appointment, but... Send him up, Evelyn said before the sentence was finished. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window and stood there for a moment, not because she needed to look at the view, but because she needed 10 seconds to put herself back together before he walked in. She was aware with some wry part of her brain that she hadn't needed 10 seconds before a meeting since she was 29 years old. When the door opened, he was wearing the same kind of thing he always wore: work clothes, nothing formal, jacket that had seen a few winters. He looked slightly out of place in the 42nd floor office, and not remotely uncomfortable about it. He stood in the doorway. You said whatever it looks like for me, he said. I did, she said. He came in. He didn't sit down, which meant she didn't sit down either. And they stood in her office, with the city spreading out behind her, and he looked at her with that same direct measuring quality that had arrested her attention in an alley 3 months ago. "Here's what I can offer," he said. "Not an answer to anything, not a yes to anything." He paused. "I can offer being honest with you the same as I expect you to be honest with me. I can offer, I don't know. Presence, I guess, when I have it, which isn't always. I can offer that Emma is not a negotiating chip or a complication. She's the whole ballgame." "I understand that," Evelyn said. "I need to know that you actually do," he said. "Not that you're willing to accommodate it. That you actually understand it. Because there's a version of this where you think accommodation is the same thing as understanding, and it's not, and that version doesn't end well." Evelyn looked at him steadily. She thought about Dana. She thought about what she'd been turning over for 6 weeks. She thought about her own father and the version of him she'd spent 30 years looking for. "I understand," she said, "that you have already decided what matters most to you, and that it was decided long before I walked into your life, and it will remain decided long after, regardless of what I do. And that my job," she paused on the word deliberately, "is not to change that, not to rearrange it, not to find the version of you that has more room. My job, if there's any kind of anything here at all, is to figure out who I am in relation to that truth, and whether I can show up for it honestly." He was quiet. "Was that close?" she said. Something moved through his expression. Not the fractional almost smile this time. Something quieter and more genuine. "Yeah," he said. "That was close." They stood in the 42nd floor office, and the city sat below them, and nothing was decided, nothing was promised, nothing was named. But something shifted in the room. Some weight redistributed itself. Some pressure released the way a door doesn't announce it's open. It just stops being closed. "There's a diner in Sunnyside," Evelyn said. "I know it," he said dryly. "Next Thursday, 7 o'clock. No pitch, no agenda." She met his eyes. Just two people who are trying to figure out what's honest. Jackson Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and picked up a pen from her desk just to have something to do with his hand the way she'd picked up the coffee mug and set it back down. 7 o'clock, he said. He turned and walked out of her office, and Evelyn stood at the window and watched the door close and let out a breath that she hadn't known she was holding. Downstairs, crossing the lobby toward the street, Jackson pulled out his phone and sent a text to Mrs. Caruso, asking if she could watch Emma next Thursday evening. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and went back to work. Thursday came the way important things always do, unremarkably, with no announcement, just another day that happened to carry more weight than the ones around it. Evelyn got to the diner at 6:52. She'd told her driver to drop her a block away, which she hadn't done the first time, and she wasn't entirely sure why she did it now, except that walking the last block felt like the right thing, some small way of arriving on her own terms, instead of being delivered. She wore a coat she'd owned for 6 years, dark wool nothing that announced anything. She'd stood in her closet for longer than she wanted to admit before choosing it. Jackson was already there. Of course he was. He was the kind of man who was always already there. He was in the same booth as last time, coffee in front of him, looking at his phone with the focused efficiency of someone clearing a task before the real thing started. He looked up when she came in, and she noticed the way she'd been noticing things about him that she'd have never paid attention to with anyone else. That he put the phone face down on the table before she'd even reached the booth. Not in his pocket, just face down. The small, deliberate act of setting something aside. She sat down across from him. "No pitch, no agenda," he said by way of greeting. "No pitch, no agenda," she confirmed. The waitress came, and Evelyn ordered coffee, and didn't look at the menu, and Jackson said he was fine. And for a moment, they just sat there, with the comfortable noise of the diner around them, and it was not awkward exactly. More like the silence of two people who both know they're about to say something real, and are taking a breath before it. "Can I ask you something first?" Jackson said. "That's what we're here for." He looked at her steadily. "What happened to you that made you work the way you work?" She blinked. She'd prepared herself, if prepare was even the right word, for the conversation to go in a certain direction, for it to be about them, about what was or wasn't possible, about terms and understandings. She had not prepared for that. "That's a big opening question," she said. "You asked me first time in this booth why I am the way I am," he said. Seemed fair. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. It was a gesture she'd picked up from him without realizing it, and she was aware of that and didn't stop. "What do you want to know specifically?" "You run a $4 billion company," he said. "You've been doing it since you were 34. You've got a security detail because people have actually tried to take things from you, and you're not surprised by that, which means it's happened enough times that surprised isn't your first response anymore." He paused. "You tracked down a stranger because he didn't want anything from you, and that was unusual enough to stop you cold. So I'm asking what made you—" Evelyn looked at the table, then back at him. "My father," she said. "Mostly." She told him the version she didn't usually tell. Not the official biography version, self-made, mentored by her father, took the company public at 38, but the actual version. The father who was electric in a room and missing from a kitchen. Who told her she could do anything and then wasn't there to see it. Who loved her, she believed that, but whose love had always been conditional on her being impressive enough to warrant his attention on any given day. She told Jackson about the dance recital. She was 11, she had a solo. It was not a big deal, and it was everything. And how her father had sent his assistant with flowers and a note that said, "Heard you were wonderful." She had kept that note for years. She told Jackson not because it was sweet, but because she needed evidence that he had thought of her at all. "I decided somewhere in there," she said, "that I would never need anyone to show up. I would be too busy, too successful, too full to notice if someone didn't come." Jackson listened. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't offer comfort, and he didn't do the thing people do where they wait for you to pause so they can relate it back to their own experience. He just listened, and his listening had a quality she'd never quite encountered. It was active without being intrusive, like someone who understood that witnessing something was its own form of respect. "Did it work?" he asked when she finished. "I thought it did." She turned the mug. "For a long time, I thought it did. And now," she looked at him, "I met a man in an alley who wasn't impressed by any of it, and it turned out that mattered more to me than I'd like to admit." Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not unimpressed by what you've built. I want to be clear about that. What you've done it's real and it's significant, but you're right that it doesn't change the math for me. It just doesn't factor in." "I know," she said. "That's the thing. I know it doesn't. And I spent about 3 weeks being confused about why that made me respect you more instead of less." "Did you figure it out?" "Dana helped," she said, and almost smiled. "She's a friend. She's aggressively honest, which is either the most valuable quality a person can have, or the most exhausting depending on the day." "What did she say?" "She said I've been surrounded my entire career by people who want things and will bend to get them, and that you were the first person in a long time who simply wasn't bending. And that I confused that for a puzzle when it was actually just integrity." He absorbed that without reacting. Then, "Your friend Dana sounds like she's worth keeping." "She's insufferable and indispensable," Evelyn said, which is basically the same thing. That got something from him, not the fractional almost smile from the first dinner, but a real one, this time briefer, and less guarded, arriving and retreating before she could fully catalog it. It did something to her chest that she'd stopped trying to classify. They talked for 2.5 hours. She learned things she hadn't gotten from Patricia's file, which covered facts and produced nothing real. She learned that Jackson had grown up with a grandfather who'd been a Korean War veteran and had taught him to fish and to be quiet, and that those two things had shaped him more than almost anything that came after. She learned that he'd enlisted at 18, not because he had no options, but because he needed structure. He was very precise about that distinction, and she understood that it mattered to him. She learned that his wife Claire had died of a brain aneurysm when Emma was 3 years old and Jackson was 37, that it had been completely without warning, that she had put Emma down for a nap and sat down on the couch, and that was it. 11 years of marriage, gone in an afternoon. He said this without breaking, without reaching for language to make it more bearable. He said it the way he said most things, directly, with the quiet authority of someone who had already done the work of surviving something and wasn't going to pretend it had been anything other than what it was. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. And then, because hollow condolence felt wrong with this man, that must have remade everything. "It did," he said. "You don't come back from that the same. You come back as someone else, and you spend a while figuring out who that person is." He looked at the coffee mug. "I figured out pretty quickly that who I needed to be was Emma's dad. Everything else got organized around that." "Do you ever miss who you were before?" He thought about that. Genuinely thought, which was something she'd noticed he did. He didn't fill silence with an immediate answer, the way people do when they're performing consideration rather than having it. "Sometimes," he said. "The guy before was easier in some ways, less careful, lighter." He paused. "But I wouldn't trade the direction. What I am now it's more mine. Harder, but more mine." Evelyn heard that and sat very still, because it had landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to go. She thought about herself at 34, the year she'd taken the company. She thought about who she'd been before that, still driven, still capable, but lighter. In some way she could barely remember now. She had become, over 15 years, someone she entirely recognized and only partly liked. Competent. Formidable. Occasionally lonely in the specific way that people get lonely when they're surrounded by others but known by no one. Harder, but more mine. She understood that more than she was comfortable admitting. The diner was nearly empty by the time they stopped. The waitress had refilled their coffees 3 times with the benevolent patience of someone who'd seen every kind of conversation happen in her section and had made peace with all of them. When they walked out, it was colder than it had been, and their breath made small clouds between them on the sidewalk. "Same time next week," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment. "Emma has a thing next Thursday. School project presentation. She's been working on it for 2 weeks." He said it without apology and without explanation, just information. "The week after," Evelyn said. He nodded. "Then, you could come to the aquarium." She went very still. "What?" "Saturday. Emma and I are going to the aquarium. She wants to see the octopus." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything, but she understood. She was beginning to understand how he communicated the information that lived underneath the plain surface of his words, that this was significant, that he was not a man who made casual invitations. "It's not a date," he added with a precision that she appreciated. "It's an aquarium trip, with a 7-year-old who will talk about cephalopods for the entire duration." "I would like that," Evelyn said. She heard her own voice come out quieter than usual. "Very much." He nodded once. 11 o'clock. I'll text you the address." He started to turn. Then he stopped, which was unusual. He wasn't a man who stopped on his way somewhere. "Evelyn," he said. First name. She registered it fully. She looked at him. "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it the right way." He turned back halfway, which was his version of full attention, when he was about to say something careful. "What you told me tonight about your father, about the recital, about how you built what you built, to not need anyone that wasn't nothing. Most people don't say that to someone they've known for 5 minutes. I'm not saying most people don't feel it. I'm saying they don't say it." He looked at her directly. "I'm glad you said it." She didn't have an immediate response, which was uncommon enough that she noticed it. "Thank you," she said finally, "for hearing it." He nodded, and this time he did walk away, and she watched him go until she couldn't see him anymore, and then stood there in the cold November air outside a diner in Sunnyside, thinking about what it meant that she didn't feel small this time. This time, she just felt like herself. A real, full, slightly complicated version of herself that she didn't have a lot of practice presenting to people. And that felt unexpectedly like progress. Saturday came with gray skies and the particular cold of a New York November that settles in for the season and doesn't apologize. Evelyn arrived at the aquarium entrance at 10:58. She had gone back and forth more than she'd like to admit about what to wear, and had landed eventually on something simple. Jeans, a good sweater, the kind of boots that could actually walk in. No jewelry except earrings. Nothing that said, "I am trying to impress a 7-year-old," because that kind of trying always showed, and children had an uncanny ability to smell it from across a room. They were already there. Emma spotted her before Jackson did, or perhaps at exactly the same moment. It was hard to tell, because the girl's attention moved fast and lit on everything, with the restless intensity of someone who found the world endlessly interesting. She was smaller than Evelyn had pictured, which wasn't rational, because she'd known the girl was 7. Dark eyes, her father's jaw, her mother's. Something that Evelyn couldn't name, but could see in the way she held her chin when she looked at you. "You're Evelyn," Emma said. "I am," Evelyn said. "Dad said you were coming." Emma seemed to be conducting some rapid internal assessment. "Do you like octopuses?" "I don't know very much about them," Evelyn said honestly. "I was hoping you could help with that." This appeared to be exactly the right answer. Emma's expression shifted into something businesslike and satisfied the expression of someone who had just been assigned a purpose. Jackson was watching this exchange with his arms crossed and his weight slightly back, the posture of a man who was prepared for whatever was going to happen and had made peace with not controlling it. "Hi," he said to Evelyn. "Hi," she said back. They went inside, and Emma immediately took the lead with the authority of someone who had been studying for this trip, which she had. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. Notes. Evelyn realized handwritten notes in a child's careful printing and referred to it at intervals as they moved through the exhibits. Jackson walked a little behind, close enough to be present, giving Emma room to be in charge of the day without hovering. At the jellyfish tanks, Emma pressed both palms flat against the glass and narrated quietly to herself. At the shark tunnel, she looked up and said very seriously, "Sharks are misunderstood." At the touch pool, she spent 8 minutes with a horseshoe crab and explained to Evelyn that they were technically more related to spiders than to crabs, which she said as though she expected this to cause distress. "That's genuinely alarming," Evelyn said. Emma looked at her, then laughed, a short, delighted sound that she seemed slightly surprised to have made. Like Evelyn had passed a test she hadn't known she was giving. Jackson, walking beside Evelyn while Emma darted ahead to the next exhibit, said quietly, "She doesn't laugh like that with most people." "She's extraordinary," Evelyn said, and meant it completely. "She is," he said. "Simple. No modifier, no qualification. Just, she is." When they reached the octopus exhibit, Emma stopped talking. This was remarkable, because Emma had not stopped talking in the previous hour and 40 minutes. She just stood in front of the tank and looked, and the octopus, a large Pacific giant, arms tucked against the glass, seemed to look back. Evelyn stood beside the girl and looked too, and in her peripheral vision, she could see Jackson standing slightly apart from both of them, watching his daughter watch the octopus with an expression that was so private and so full that Evelyn felt like she had walked accidentally into something sacred and should be very quiet about it. "She's thinking," Emma whispered. "The octopus," Evelyn said. "They always are." Emma didn't look away from the glass. "They remember things. They recognize faces. They dream." She paused. "Scientists aren't sure what they dream about, but they do." Evelyn looked at the octopus, pale and enormous against the blue glass. "What do you think she dreams about?" Evelyn asked. Emma considered this for a moment with complete seriousness. "The ocean, probably," she said. "What it felt like to be out there. Before." Evelyn stood very still next to the 7-year-old girl and felt something quiet and enormous move through her that she didn't try to name. After the aquarium, they walked to a sandwich place Emma had specifically requested, and Emma sat across from both of them and ate her turkey sandwich in the methodical, focused way of a child who was simultaneously thinking about 6 other things, and managed to hold court for 45 minutes on the topics of ocean acidification, the best season of a nature documentary series she was watching with her father, and whether or not her teacher, Mr. Patel, was actually smart or just teacher smart, a distinction she appeared to find meaningful. Evelyn answered questions when they came her way, and mostly just listened because listening to Emma was its own experience. She talked the way Jackson listened, with a quality that was entirely her own. At one point, Emma turned to her father and said out of nowhere, "Dad, I think Evelyn is good." Jackson raised an eyebrow. Yeah. Emma went back to her sandwich with the finality of someone who had delivered a verdict and considered the matter settled. Jackson looked across the table at Evelyn. His expression was doing the thing where very little moved, but something communicated anyway. Evelyn looked back at him. She felt the heat of something she'd stopped trying to suppress rising in her chest. Not urgency, not want, in the grasping way she was used to, but something slower and more serious. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding what she was actually in. On the subway platform, after waiting for Emma's train back to Queens, Evelyn's car would come separately. Emma hugged Evelyn with the sudden full commitment of a child who does nothing halfway. Arms around her waist cheek pressed into her coat. Evelyn stood there for a second, both hands uncertain in the air, before she put them down gently on the girl's shoulders. Emma pulled back and looked up at her. "Will you come again?" "If your dad says it's okay," Evelyn said. Emma looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at his daughter, then at Evelyn, and then back at his daughter. "It's okay," he said. Emma nodded satisfied and went back to stand beside her father on the platform. Jackson put a hand lightly on her head, without looking down, an automatic gesture that he probably didn't even register he'd made. The train came. They got on. Evelyn stood on the platform and watched the doors close. She stood there for a moment after the train was gone, in the underground noise and the artificial light, and she thought about Emma's voice saying, "She's thinking in front of the octopus tank." She thought about Jackson's face watching his daughter. She thought about a little girl who had never known her mother and had a father who had quietly decided to be everything she needed every day, without asking for recognition or relief, just because she came first and always would. Evelyn Blackstone had built a company from the ground up. She had made decisions that affected thousands of people and had lived with the weight of all of them. She had stood in rooms with presidents and walked away from nine-figure deals and had been, for most of her adult life, the most certain person in any given space. She had never, not once, in 46 years, wanted to be worthy of something the way she wanted to be worthy of what she'd seen today. She pulled out her phone. She typed a message to Jackson. "Thank you for today, both of you." His response came before she'd reached the top of the stairs. "She's already asking when you're coming to dinner." Evelyn stopped on the stairs. "Read it again." Felt the smile arrive before she could decide anything about it. She typed, "What does she want to make?" He replied, "She doesn't cook, she supervises. There's a difference." Evelyn laughed out loud on the subway stairs alone in the cold, and a man coming down the other way looked at her with the startled expression of someone who'd encountered unexpected joy and wasn't sure what to do with it. She pocketed the phone and came up into the gray November afternoon and hailed her car, and she sat in the back seat on the way uptown and did not think about quarterly projections or board dynamics or any of the thousand things that usually colonized her mind in transit. She thought about an octopus pressed against blue glass, and a 7-year-old who believed it was dreaming about the ocean, and a man on a subway platform with his hand resting on his daughter's head like it was the most natural thing in the world. And she thought, I don't want to take any of this apart. I just want to be close enough to it to understand what it feels like to care about something this much. It was the clearest thought she'd had in years. Dinner happened on a Wednesday. Evelyn arrived at Jackson's apartment in Queens at 6:30 with a bottle of wine she'd spent 20 minutes choosing and then second-guessed in the elevator, and a box of pastries from a French bakery in Midtown that she'd ordered because she didn't know what else to bring to a 7-year-old's dinner, and pastries felt safe. She stood outside the door for a moment, just a moment, and told herself to stop being ridiculous. Then she knocked. Emma opened the door. She was wearing an apron that was 3 sizes too large and had been folded up at the waist with the improvised engineering of a child who was absolutely going to be in charge of this situation. She looked at the pastry box, and her eyes went immediately and completely professional. "Are those from a good place?" she asked. "I think so," Evelyn said. Emma considered this. Dad says you can tell a bakery by whether they use real butter. Did they use real butter? They told me they did. People say that, Emma said with the world-weary skepticism of someone who had been lied to about butter before. She stepped back to let Evelyn in. We'll see. Jackson was in the kitchen. She could hear him from the door, the specific sound of someone who cooks with confidence rather than anxiety, pans that moved with purpose rather than clatter. He appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and looked at her with the same quiet, assessing attention she'd become familiar enough with, that it no longer unsettled her. It did something else to her now that she'd stopped calling unsettled. You found it okay, he said. I've been to Queens before, she said. Right. The edge of his mouth moved. Come in. The apartment was exactly what she would have expected, and nothing like what she'd imagined, which she recognized as her own contradiction. It was modest, a two-bedroom in a building that had good bones and no pretension, but it was not sparse. It was full in the way that spaces get when someone actually lives in them. Books on a shelf that had been actually read, spines cracked and pages bent. A drawing taped to the refrigerator that was, she realized, an octopus rendered in 7 different colors by a child who had clearly spent real effort on it. A pair of small sneakers by the door, sitting next to a pair of large work boots, with the unself-conscious intimacy of 2 people who belonged in the same space. Emma pulled her by the hand to the kitchen and began explaining dinner with the comprehensive authority of a head of state delivering a policy briefing. Jackson had made the pasta and the sauce. Emma had been responsible for the salad, which she described as mostly mine except Dad cut the tomatoes because of the knife. She had also, she noted, selected the music currently playing from a small speaker on the counter, which was a nature documentary soundtrack that she had chosen because it was, in her words, the right energy. For pasta, Evelyn said. For everything, Emma said firmly. They ate at a kitchen table that had been set with a kind of careful deliberateness that Evelyn understood had required effort. The napkins folded, the glasses matched. Emma sat across from both of them and conducted the dinner conversation with the agenda-setting efficiency of someone who had clearly been thinking about this all day. She had questions. Not polite questions, not the performing for adults questions that children sometimes produce, real questions, the kind that came from actual curiosity about the world. She asked Evelyn what it felt like to run a company. She asked whether Evelyn had ever fired someone and whether that was sad. She asked whether Evelyn's office was actually on the 42nd floor because her dad had mentioned it, and she had looked up how high 42 floors was and wanted confirmation. She asked, pivoting without warning, whether Evelyn thought octopuses were lonely because they were solitary animals and didn't really have family groups, and she had been thinking about this since the aquarium. That's a serious question, Evelyn said. I know, Emma said. Evelyn thought about it, actually thought the way Jackson thought, not filling space, but actually considering. I think loneliness requires a certain awareness of what you're missing, she said finally. I think maybe octopuses are complete in themselves, not lonely, just whole in a different way than animals that live in groups. Emma looked at her for a moment, then at her father, then back at Evelyn with an expression that was both evaluating and apparently approving. That's a good answer, she said, and went back to her pasta. Jackson caught Evelyn's eye across the table. He said nothing. He didn't need to. After dinner, Emma disappeared into her room to read. She was, Jackson explained, in the middle of a book about deep-sea creatures that she treated with the focused devotion of someone completing a professional obligation, and Jackson and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the wine and the good pastries which Emma had assessed formally before dinner and declared acceptable, and they talked the way they'd been talking for weeks now, in that particular register that had developed between them, honest without performance, a little careful in the places where the ground was softer. She's going to start asking questions, Jackson said at one point, about what this is. What will you tell her? Evelyn said. The truth in whatever version makes sense at her age. He turned the wine glass. That you're someone we're getting to know. That it's not simple. He paused. That good things sometimes aren't simple. Is that what this is? Evelyn asked. A good thing. He looked at her directly. I don't let people into this apartment, he said. I don't let people sit at that table with her. I have had exactly 2 people in the last 4 years who have had dinner here who weren't family or Mrs. Caruso." "I know," she said quietly. "So, yeah," he said. "I think it's a good thing." She held that for a moment. Outside, a siren passed, and the city sound filtered through the window and faded, and it was quiet again. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking about the job," she said. "Not the one I originally offered you. That was something else. I understand that now. But I have a genuine problem. I have a director of operations position that's been sitting open for 6 months because I cannot find someone with the right combination of logistical intelligence, situational judgment, and operational discipline. The position is 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. No travel requirements beyond New York Metro. Full flexibility on schedule as long as the work gets done." She met his eyes. "I'm not pitching you. I'm telling you it exists, and I'm telling you I would rather have you in that role than anyone I have interviewed, and I'm telling you that if you want to think about it, the offer is there, without this attached to it. They're 2 completely separate things." Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "You practiced that," he said. "Twice?" she admitted. "To make sure it sounded like 2 separate things." "To make sure it was 2 separate things," she said. "In my own head, before I said it to you." He looked at the wine glass. He turned it again, the quarter rotation the habit. "Why that position?" "Because it fits," she said simply. "Your background, your skill set, the way you think about problems. I watched you handle a 3-man threat in under 10 seconds, with nothing but your hands and 1 word. Do you know how long it takes me to find someone who can manage a operations crisis without falling apart? The way you processed that alley, the threat assessment, the economy of the response, the way you made sure the situation was fully clear before you moved on, that's exactly what I need in someone who manages operational risk for a 1,200-person company." He said nothing. "You don't have to answer now," she said. "Or ever. I mean it about them being separate." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why I'm not saying no immediately." He picked up his wine glass, looked at it, set it down again without drinking. "I need to think." "Take whatever time you need." He nodded slowly. Then, "How long has it been open?" 6 months, she said. "And you're only telling me now." "I was going to tell you the first time," she said. "Then I decided I wanted to know who you were first, before I put work into the room between us." Something in his expression shifted something small and serious. "That was smart," he said. "I have my moments," she said. He almost smiled. "You have a lot of them. You just work very hard not to look like you're having them." She looked at him. "You see things," she said. It came out quieter than she meant it to. "Occupational habit," he said. Then more quietly, "And I pay attention. To you specifically. Which I don't say to make it weird, I say it because you deserve to know it." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn thought about her father, about the recital, about the note that said, "Heard you were wonderful." She thought about all the years of building something enormous to fill a space that had nothing to do with money or power, and she thought about sitting in a kitchen in Queens across from a man who paid attention, not because it served him, not because there was something to gain from it, but because she was there, and he'd decided she was worth paying attention to. That was the whole reason. She was there, and he'd decided. She said, "I don't know how to do this well." He said, "What does that mean?" "It means, I'm very good at a lot of things," she said. "And this is not one of them. Being open, letting things be slow, letting something develop without trying to manage the outcome." She paused. "I'm aware that I still have impulses in that direction. To manage it. I'm working on it." "I know," he said. "I can see you working on it." "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I'm watching," he said. "And because I do the same thing, different version. Mine's I manage by limiting. If I don't let something in, I can't lose control of it." He was quiet for a second. "That's what I had to think about after the diner. After you said you understood what the priorities were. Because the risk isn't that you disrespect the priorities. The risk is that I'd let something in, and then have to make a call I wasn't ready to make." She felt the weight of what he'd just offered. She understood the specific kind of disclosure that Jackson Reynolds did not make casually. She treated it accordingly. "What changed?" she said. "What made you come upstairs that day?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "You said my job is to figure out who I am in relation to that truth. You didn't say you'd accommodate it. You didn't say you'd be patient. You said you'd figure out who you are." He looked at her. "That's a different thing. That's somebody doing actual work. I can respect actual work." She sat with that. Then, "Does Emma know that her showing up at the aquarium saying I was good, does she know what that meant?" "She's 7, he said. "She knows she liked you, and she said so. She doesn't know the rest of it." "She's perceptive," Evelyn said. "More than she lets on." "All the time," he said with a quiet mix of pride and something that was almost worry, the specific parental worry of a man who knew his child was watching everything and was grateful for it, and terrified by it simultaneously. A sound from the hallway, small footsteps, and then Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, in pajamas holding her book with a finger in it to mark the page. "I can't figure something out," she said, addressing both of them with the democratic fairness of someone who didn't believe in wasting a good audience. "What is it?" Jackson said. "The book says anglerfish females are much bigger than males, and the male just attaches to the female and becomes part of her body, and she provides all the nutrients." Emma's face was deeply serious. "That seems like a bad deal for the male." Jackson looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Jackson. "It does seem unbalanced," Evelyn said carefully. "The book says it's an evolutionary adaptation," Emma said with the precision of someone quoting directly from memory. "But I think someone should look into it more." "I'll write a note," Jackson said. Emma looked at him to check if he was being funny. Decided he probably was. "Dad?" "Bed," he said but gently. "You can look into it more tomorrow." Emma looked at Evelyn. "Will you come back?" "If your dad says it's okay," Evelyn said, which was what she had said at the aquarium, and Emma's expression indicated she remembered this, and found it an acceptable answer for the same reasons she had the first time. "It's okay," Jackson said. Emma came across the kitchen and hugged Evelyn with the same complete commitment as before, total, unqualified, zero tentativeness, and said goodnight and went back down the hallway, and they heard her door close. The kitchen settled back into quiet. "She does that," Jackson said. "Decides on people. Takes her a while, and then she just decides." "She decided on me," Evelyn said. "She decided on you at the aquarium," he said. "Tonight was just confirmation." Evelyn looked at her wine glass. She felt something moving in her throat that she was not going to allow to become anything embarrassing. And she swallowed it and breathed and looked back up. "Tell me something," she said. What would Claire think," she said, "of this, of all of it?" It was a risk. She knew it was a risk before she asked it, but she had decided somewhere over the last few weeks that the right way to be in a room with Jackson Reynolds was honestly, and that meant asking the thing she actually wanted to know instead of the safe version of it. He looked at her for a long moment. His face went somewhere private and then came back. "She would have liked you," he said. "She didn't have a lot of patience for people who weren't real. She would have appreciated the thing at the diner when you said you hadn't been honest with yourself. She would have said, 'Okay, this one's being honest, I can work with this one.'" He paused. "She also would have probably told me I waited too long to let anyone in. She was always more generous than me, in that direction." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Evelyn said. "She was," he said. Simple. Present tense would have been easier, and he used past tense because he was who he was. She was. They were quiet together for a while, and the quiet wasn't empty. It had the texture of two people sitting with something real and not needing to fill it. When Evelyn left, he walked her to the elevator, not to her car, not to the building entrance, just to the elevator, which felt right for where they were, the right distance for the right moment. They stood in the hallway, and he looked at her with that steady, dark attention that had stopped her cold in an alley 4 months ago. "The job," he said. "I'll think about it." "I know," she said. "And the other thing." He said it without naming it, because neither of them was in the business of naming things before they were ready to be named. "I'm in this. Whatever this is. I'm in it." She held his gaze. "So am I." He nodded once. She got on the elevator. The doors closed. She rode down to the lobby alone and walked out into the Queen's night, and her car was at the curb, and Marcus was standing beside it in the patient professional way of a man who had driven her through 15 years of late evenings and never once asked where she'd been. She got in the back seat. He pulled into traffic. For a while she didn't look at her phone, didn't check email, didn't think about the board or the open operations position or the acquisition she had a call about in the morning. She looked out the window at the city going past and thought about a kitchen with a drawing of an octopus on the refrigerator and a pair of small sneakers next to a pair of large work boots by the door, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone builds a life instead of a resume. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be in relation to that. Not alongside it, not adjacent to it actually. In relation to it, actually connected, actually willing to be changed by it. She had spent 46 years being very good at building walls and calling them discipline. She thought it might be time to learn what she was like without them. Her phone buzzed. She looked down. It was from a number she didn't recognize, and it took her 3 seconds to realize why she didn't recognize it. It was Emma's school tablet, which she had apparently given Emma her contact information for at some point in the evening without tracking it. The message was a photograph. The aquarium octopus taken through blue glass, enormous and pale, and somehow more present in the photo than most things Evelyn had ever seen photographed. Underneath it, one line of a child's careful typing, she was thinking about us. Probably Evelyn looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she typed back, "I think you're right." She put the phone in her lap and looked back out the window, and the city moved around her the way it always had, enormous and indifferent and full of lives stacked on top of each other. Millions of people, all building their own versions of what mattered. And for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Blackstone did not feel like she was outside of all of it looking in. She felt quietly and without drama like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Which was a feeling she had no prior experience with and had not expected to arrive in the back of a car on a Wednesday night in November. But there it was. December came in cold and certain the way endings do when they've made up their minds. Jackson called her on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. They texted mostly had fallen into the particular rhythm of two people who respected each other's workdays and filled the gaps between them with messages that were short and real, and sometimes increasingly funny. A call in the middle of a Tuesday meant something. She picked up on the second ring. "I'll take the job," he said. She was standing at her office window with a coffee she'd forgotten to drink, looking at the city 42 floors below, and she stayed very still for a moment, because she understood that this required the right response, not the business response, not the relieved response, not the one that led on how much the question had occupied her for the past 3 weeks. "Okay," she said. "I have conditions," he said. "Tell me." "The schedule is fixed. I'm at Emma's school bus at 3:15. That's not negotiable on any day for any reason." He said it not as an ultimatum, but as information the way he always delivered things that were simply true. "If there's a crisis that needs me past 3, I need enough lead time to arrange coverage for her. That means communication. Real communication, not last minute." "Agreed," she said. "I report to you directly or I don't take it. I'm not interested in navigating a chain of command to do my job." "That was already the structure," she said. "I want it in writing." "You'll have it." A pause. She heard him breathe. "And the last thing." She waited. "Whatever is happening between us, the other thing it runs on a completely separate track. If this job stops working, that doesn't end because of it. And if the other thing stops working..." He paused. "I still have to do this job well. Emma's watching how I handle things. I need to handle this one right." "Jackson," she said. "Yeah. I was going to put all of that in the contract anyway." A beat of silence. Then, very quietly, what she was almost certain was the real version of his laugh. Not the controlled, almost smile. Not the dry sound she'd heard once or twice. The actual thing brief and low, and entirely unguarded. "Of course you were," he said. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he said, and hung up. Evelyn set the phone down on her desk and picked up the coffee and looked out the window and felt something she recognized after a moment as relief. Not the relief of winning something, but the relief of something fitting. Correctly the way a door sounds when it finally closes, flush with the frame after years of sticking. She called Patricia and told her to draft the offer letter. Patricia said she would and didn't ask questions. She had not asked questions in 6 years, which was why Evelyn had kept her for 6 years. Then she sat down at her desk and went back to work, which was what she always did, except that the quality of the morning had shifted in some way that was difficult to articulate and entirely real. He started on a Monday, and he was good at it in exactly the way she had known he would be, which was to say completely and without announcement. He did not make a performance of competence. He simply walked into problems and resolved them with the same economy of effort he'd applied to everything else she'd seen him do. And within 2 weeks her operations team, which had been running on the particular strained energy of people without adequate leadership, began to breathe differently. Her VP of operations, a sharp, skeptical woman named Grace Chen, who had been with the company for 9 years and had seen 3 directors come and go, stopped by Evelyn's office at the end of Jackson's second week. "Where did you find him?" Grace said. "He pulled me out of a mugging," Evelyn said. Grace looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to pretend that's a metaphor." "It's not," Evelyn said. Grace shook her head and left, which was its own form of endorsement. The 2 tracks ran parallel, the way Jackson had said they would. At work he was direct and professional, and treated her with the same clear-eyed respect he treated everyone else, which she appreciated more than any deference would have provided. He did not act differently around her. He did not perform for her. When he disagreed with something she'd decided, he said so plainly and in private, and when she pushed back, he listened and sometimes conceded and sometimes held his position. And either way, the thing got resolved and they moved forward. She had not been disagreed with that cleanly in years. On Thursday evenings, they went to the diner in Sunnyside, which had become, without being formally designated as such, their place. The waitress, her name was Rosie, they'd learned, and she'd been working there for 17 years, had stopped giving them menus, and now just brought coffee when she saw them come in, which was the closest thing to a public acknowledgement of their situation that had occurred. On alternate Saturdays, Evelyn came to Queens for dinner. Emma had relaxed entirely into her presence, which meant she no longer evaluated Evelyn and simply included her, pulled her into the ongoing project of her intellectual life with the easy authority of someone who had decided a person was useful and was going to make full use of them. She consulted Evelyn about her school presentation on ocean conservation. She showed Evelyn her nature documentary rankings, which she had written out by hand on a piece of paper she kept in her desk. She taught Evelyn one evening how to play the card game she and Jackson played on weeknights, which had rules so specific and occasionally invented that Evelyn suspected Jackson of letting Emma bend them. "You're letting her make up rules," Evelyn said to Jackson quietly while Emma was getting more cards from the other room. "I've been letting her make up rules since she was 5, he said. "She always explains them so confidently that it takes me a while to notice. That's going to be a problem when she gets older. That's going to make her exceptional when she gets older," he said. "She negotiates like a closer." Emma came back with the cards, and Evelyn looked at her. This small, serious, full person who dreamed about the ocean and took notes on folded paper and had decided with complete conviction that Evelyn was good, and felt something she had been feeling more and more often lately without knowing exactly what to call it. It wasn't happiness exactly, or it wasn't only happiness. It was more like rightness. The specific sensation of being in a place that fit. It was the second week of December when the thing happened that she hadn't prepared for. She was at work late, a genuine crisis, a data breach in one of their client systems, that had required all hands and had kept her in the building until nearly 8, and she had sent her team home in waves as the situation resolved, and was finally sitting alone in her office, going through the last of the incident reports, when her door opened. Jackson. He was in his coat, which meant he'd come from outside, not from somewhere else in the building. He held 2 coffees from the cart on the ground floor and looked at her across the office with that steady assessment. "Emma's at her grandmother's tonight," he said. "I got your message about the breach." He crossed the room and set one of the coffees on her desk. "How bad is it?" "Contained," she said. "Resolved technically. The paperwork is—" She gestured at the screen. "How are you?" he said. She looked up. He was still standing, coat still on, watching her with the particular quality of his attention that she had stopped pretending didn't affect her. She stopped. "I've been better." "Talk," he said. Which was what Dana said, but in a different voice, and from a different place, and it landed differently. She talked. She told him about the breach, yes, but she also told him the other thing. The thing underneath the breach, which was that she had a board member who had been quietly building a case for reducing her operational authority for 6 months, and that this incident, contained and resolved as it was, would become ammunition. She told him about the specific calculus of leading something at scale, the way success became its own form of vulnerability, the way she had spent 15 years being right, often enough that being wrong, once in any visible way, cost disproportionately. She told him she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours. He listened. He sat down across from her, and listened the way he always listened, with that active, unobtrusive quality that made her feel heard without feeling managed. When she finished, he said, "What do you need right now? Not tomorrow. Right now." Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not in that form. Not with that directness, that orientation toward the immediate rather than the strategic. She opened her mouth and then closed it, and then said honestly, "I don't know. I'm not used to being asked." "I know," he said. "Think about it." She thought about it. She looked at the incident reports on her screen, and the coffee he'd brought, and his face in the lamplight of her office, and the city dark beyond the window. "I think I need to go home," she said, "and not think about this for the rest of tonight." He stood up. "I'll walk you down." They rode the elevator in a silence that was comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable, not empty, not tense, just 2 people who had gotten past the point of needing to fill space between them. In the lobby, he held the door for her, and they stood outside in the December cold while Marcus pulled the car around. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said. "Jackson." She said it and then stopped because she was about to say something that she hadn't planned and hadn't rehearsed and wasn't sure she was ready for, except that she also understood that ready was sometimes a thing you only got to by going first. "I know what this is," she said. "What I feel. I've known for a while, and I've been careful about it because I didn't want to misread the situation or put pressure on something that was still figuring out what it was. But I know what it is." She looked at him. "And I'm not going to say it in a parking lot on a Tuesday night in December. That's not the right time for it. But I wanted you to know that I know, and that I'm not afraid of it." He looked at her for a long moment. The cold moved between them, and neither of them stepped back from it. "I know what it is, too," he said. "For me." He paused. "And I'm not afraid of it either. I was. For a while I was." He said it with the directness he applied to everything. This is what was true. This is what changed. "I'm not anymore." Marcus pulled up. The car idled at the curb. Jackson reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. Just that, nothing more. A gesture that was careful and deliberate and entirely his, and then he stepped back. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep." "Bossy," she said. "I learned from someone," he said. She got in the car. She rode home through the December city and didn't pick up her phone once. Christmas came. It was Emma who solved the question of how they would spend it, because Emma at this point had developed a confident relationship with the logistics of her own life and saw no reason to wait for adults to figure out what was obvious. "You should come for Christmas," she told Evelyn on a Saturday evening in mid-December, with the decisive simplicity of someone issuing a calendar invitation. Evelyn looked at Jackson. He looked back at her with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had stopped trying to predict what his daughter was going to say and had made peace with responding to it. "Emma," he said. "It makes sense," Emma said with total reasonableness. "Grandma's coming. Mrs. Caruso is coming. Evelyn should come." She turned back to Evelyn. "Unless you have other plans." "I don't have other plans," Evelyn said. "See?" Emma said to her father. "She doesn't have other plans." Jackson looked at Evelyn for a moment. His expression had the quality of a man attempting to maintain appropriate parental authority while being privately pleased, which he was not entirely succeeding at. "Christmas," he said to Evelyn. "Christmas," she said. Emma nodded satisfied and went back to the book she'd been reading, having resolved the matter. Christmas morning, Evelyn arrived in Queens with too many gifts. She was aware they were too many and couldn't stop herself, which was its own thing to examine. And Jackson answered the door and looked at the bags and said without heat, "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "She's 7, he said. "She doesn't need." "I know," she said again. "I went a little, I know." She paused. "Some of them are books." He looked at her for a moment. "How many?" "Several," she said. He stepped back and let her in. Emma's grandmother. Jackson's mother-in-law. A small, precise woman named Ruth, who had Claire's eyes and a way of looking at people that went directly to the thing they were actually made of, arrived an hour later and shook Evelyn's hand with a firmness that was its own assessment, and then said very simply, "Emma talks about you constantly." "She's remarkable," Evelyn said, for what must have been the 100th time, and still meant it completely. "She is," Ruth said in exactly the way Jackson said it, the simple present tense, the absence of qualification. Something in the way this family spoke about what they loved. Evelyn thought, "I want to learn how to talk about things that way." They made breakfast together, all of them in the kitchen, Jackson at the stove, and Emma supervising the eggs with intense focus, and Evelyn cutting fruit, because Ruth had assigned her fruit and Mrs. Caruso had arrived by 9 and was already making commentary on Jackson's coffee-to-water ratio, which she considered too conservative. The kitchen was full of people and noise, and the particular warmth of a space where everyone present had decided to be there not out of obligation, but out of something more honest than that. At one point, Evelyn looked up from the cutting board and found Ruth watching her with a quiet, careful expression. "You look surprised," Ruth said. "By what?" Evelyn said. "By being here," Ruth said. "In this." She said it without accusation, just observation, the way someone who has been watching people for a long time observes them. Like you keep expecting it to turn out to be something other than what it is. Evelyn set down the knife. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I know what to look for," Ruth said. She poured herself a coffee. Claire was the same when she first started coming around. Not because she was uncertain about Jackson, because she was uncertain about whether she was allowed to want something this quiet. She looked at Evelyn steadily. "You're allowed." Evelyn held that for a moment, felt it settle somewhere in her chest, like something that had been trying to land for a long time. "Thank you," she said. "Ruth." Ruth nodded once and moved away the way people do when they've said the exact right thing and know enough to let it live on its own. After breakfast, Emma distributed gifts with the focused efficiency of a logistics coordinator, pulling items from under the tree with specific intention and delivering them to recipients in an order that apparently made sense to her. She received Jackson's gift, first a professional-grade magnifying glass and specimen kit for what she was already calling her lab, which was one corner of her bedroom, and she held it with both hands and looked up at her father with an expression that required no translation at all. "Dad," she said. "Yeah," he said. She put the kit down carefully and crossed the room and hugged him in the complete, unqualified way. She did everything arms tight, and Jackson held his daughter in the Christmas morning kitchen of a small apartment in Queens with his eyes closed for a moment, and Evelyn saw it and looked away because some things are too full to watch directly. Emma opened Evelyn's gifts last, which felt intentional. She worked through them methodically, the books first, which she examined with professional seriousness, reading back covers and first pages, and then the last one, which Evelyn had wrapped separately, and which was a framed print, a photographic reproduction of a Pacific giant octopus, taken by an underwater photographer whose work Emma would not yet know, but whose image was extraordinary, the animal huge and alive in open water, arms extended in the full, uncontained presence of something that had never needed to apologize for what it was. Emma looked at it for a very long time. Then she looked at Evelyn. "She's free," Emma said. "She is," Evelyn said. Emma nodded and held the frame carefully, and looked at it again. "I'm going to put this above my lab," she said, "so I can see it when I'm working." She got up and went to put it in her room, and the kitchen settled into the comfortable noise of a Christmas morning, and Jackson crossed to where Evelyn was standing and stood next to her, not touching, just present, which was its own language they had built, and looked at the door Emma had gone through. "She's free," he said quietly, repeating it. "She figured out what it meant faster than I did," Evelyn said. "She usually does," he said. They stood there together in the warm, full kitchen of a small apartment that contained on that particular morning everything that actually mattered, and Evelyn thought about an alley on West 47th Street, and a hand that didn't shake, and a question she'd asked in a red vinyl booth that had cracked something open in her she hadn't known was sealed. She thought about Dana saying you have absolutely no idea what it looks like when somebody loves something more than they love what they could gain from it. She thought about an octopus pressed against blue glass and a child's voice saying she's thinking. She thought about all the years she had spent building walls and calling them discipline, all the years of being the most certain person in any room, all the years of needing nothing and calling that strength. And she thought about what it had cost her, quietly, privately in the 2 a.m. hours she'd spent alone with the city outside, and the specific loneliness of a person who had confused capability for completeness. And then she stopped thinking about all of that, because Jackson reached over and took her hand. Just his hand around hers. The same hand that had moved in an alley with total certainty. Now completely still. And the kitchen kept going around them. Ruth and Mrs. Caruso debating something good-naturedly. Emma's voice calling from her room about where exactly to hang the print, the smell of coffee and breakfast, and December morning, in a space that was exactly the size of what it contained. She held his hand, and didn't manage it, and didn't calculate it, and didn't build anything around it. She just let it be what it was. Weeks later, when January had settled in, and the city had gone back to its regular pace, and the two of them had found their way into the particular, unremarkable rhythm of two people who were building something together, instead of alongside each other, Evelyn would try once to explain it to Dana. What had changed? What the thing was that had been missing and was no longer. Dana on the phone from Chicago listened all the way through without interrupting, which was its own event. Then she said, "You stopped needing to win it." Evelyn was quiet. "You've been winning things your whole life," Dana said. "Companies, rooms, arguments, people. You stopped needing to win this one. You just let it be true." "Is that what I did?" Evelyn said. "I'm a federal judge," Dana said. "I know what it looks like when somebody tells the truth." Evelyn looked out her office window at the January city. 42 floors below, somewhere in the operations of the company she had built from nothing, Jackson Reynolds was doing his job with the same absolute certainty he brought to everything. And at 3:15, he would leave to be at a school bus stop, and on Saturday she would be in a kitchen in Queens where a child was building a lab and had an octopus on the wall that was free and knew it. None of it was what Evelyn had imagined her life would look like at 46. None of it matched the architecture she'd spent 30 years constructing. It was better. Harder in different ways, and better in the ways that turned out to matter. It asked things of her she hadn't been asked before: patience and presence, and the willingness to be seen not as a CEO or a brand or an accomplishment, but as a person full-sized and imperfect, still learning how to let good things be exactly what they were without trying to improve them. She was still learning. She would be learning for a long time, but she had stopped being afraid of the lesson. And on a cold January morning, 42 floors up in a city that had always been hers, and now felt like it contained something more than ambition, Evelyn Blackstone understood at last what Jackson Reynolds had known all along: that the most powerful thing a person can do is decide what they love, protect it without apology, and refuse to let anything, not money, not status, not the world's opinion of what they should want, move them even 1 inch away from it. That was not weakness. That was the only kind of strength that lasted.